relational assessment. Like Nikki mentioned before, the presentation will look a little bit different. There's no story to begin today because we're condensing a lot of information and now running a little bit late. So we'll get right into it. We'll be talking about systems change and relational assessment. So systems change is essentially a practice to build structures that last to support the changes that we see are needed in the work that we do. When we're working in good ways, we often recognize barriers and procedures that are inappropriate, irrelevant, or harmful to our work with Indigenous communities. And as practitioners, we often create workarounds to minimize those impacts. And those workarounds would be case by case or one-time solutions. Systems change, on the other hand, is a practice that invites us to go beyond those one-time solutions to address policies and procedures that get our work at different levels within the institution. So through our consultations, we talk to people about changes that need to be done and reflected about how these changes can be made. And we identify a number of recommendations for how we can create those systems changes, and that's what we'll be talking about now. So the first thing that needs to happen is that we need to identify policies and procedures that negatively impact Indigenous communities we work with. This is one of the quotes someone shared with us during the consultations. It was a non-Indigenous faculty at the university. The person said, "I'm embarrassed about how long it takes the university to reimburse community members for their work." So we're going to use this as an example for how we can create system changes in general. So we have identified a problem. The university takes a really long time to pay community members. The next thing that we need to do is identify our circles of control, influence, and concern. As you can see here in the graphic, the circle of concern refers to the things that are in our universe, like in our work context, the things that affect us and impact us and our partners and the work that we do together. The circle of influence is the circle or the context, I guess, where we can influence different policies, decisions, procedures, and take actions that other people can build on. Our circle of control is just as what it says, the circle where we have direct control over situations. So as a coordinator, for example, following the example of paying communities on time, my circle of control has to do with when I process a payment, for example. I can process it maybe 4 weeks ahead of time because I know that the university usually takes, 2 weeks to 3 weeks to process payments to make sure that my community partners get their payments before we're starting a program. My circle of influence would be who I can talk to about this really long time that it takes to process payments. So it might be my supervisor or my supervisor's supervisor, other people in my community of practice. And my circle of concern is, again, the context within which I work. So after I have identified those different contexts, then what I need is to create and document the workarounds and one-time solutions that I create and share them with my supervisor. So in this case, if I decided I'm going to process this payment 4 weeks ahead so that it gets to the community on time, I need to document not only that process, but explain why the existing process doesn't make sense for the community. Detail the steps that I took to create this new process to prioritize the needs of the community, and then include any potential benefits for other stakeholders, including students, or other departments in the university in general. So we want to document and gather as much information as possible as to why the old system doesn't work and why this one would work better for everyone. And then once we have that documentation, we talk to our one-overs or supervisors, it's time to begin implementing and advocating for those changes. And in the framework, we recommend taking a mixed approach of organizational and grassroots. You can take these approaches separately, but we believe that if we do it together, then it works better. An organizational approach to system changes in this case would be for me to talk to my supervisor, my ED, bring this new procedure and this documentation that I created for them to take it to university and senior leadership and advocate for change from those hierarchical structures. The other approach is grassroots, and this would be me sharing with other folks like yourselves in the university who work with indigenous communities, who have the similar challenges and experience the similar barriers, so that we can begin to build community support for these systemic changes. And then different advocacy committees and working groups can use that support as leverage where they're doing the work of challenging systems within the institutions. So in a nutshell, that's in a very, 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 very condensed way, that's what we learn and share about systems change in the framework guide and the processes that we follow ourselves. When we release the framework guide during the launch on May 27th, we'll be also releasing a systems change tool where you can work through these things yourselves with your context and begin to building those changes within your departments and your organizations. So just to keep an eye open for that. So that's systems change. The other thing that we've been alluding to during this Launch and Learn series is the relational assessment process that we develop as we work on the framework. And relational assessment is something different to what we're used to when we do programming, which is program evaluation or student assessment. Program evaluation and student assessment focus on learning outcomes and program impacts. But relational assessment, as the name says, focuses on the health and quality of the relationships that underlie a partnership. So it's not so much about whether we're meeting outcomes or the students are meeting their learning outcomes, but about how those relationships are doing. Are they healthy? Are they things that need to be addressed at the relational level within the partnership? So why do we see a need to practice relational assessment? Here are 6 reasons. The first one is that it can help us identify areas of strength and weakness in our partnership. It can help us reflect on the way that partners perceive us, our work, and the university. Help us recognize changes in our relationships with the community. It can help us build trust between and amongst the community members and ourselves, and create a safe space to share difficult feedback. The last one, I think, is the most important one, is that it can help bring us back into those relationships, that trust, that history, whenever the work is getting overwhelming and we're having challenges collaborating in a good way. So how can we practice relational assessment? We'll go through a number of practices that will help. The first one is to remember that relational assessment is an ongoing process. So again, differently to evaluations that might happen at the end or at the beginning of a program, relational assessment happens throughout the 5 stages of Indigenous partnership engagement. So it begins with the work before the work, it grows along with the relationship when we're forming the partnership, and it goes through maintaining and closing the partnership, and it continues after the partnership is done, because a relationship doesn't end with a partnership. It goes beyond that. So it's a process that is always happening. Um, if we want to be able to conduct relational assessments in meaningful, impactful, and accurate ways, then the first thing we need to work on is building communication and trust with the community. And this can be done very easily through commenting and liking on social media, checking in with people over text message or phone. But every time that we do this, we're actually engaging in relational assessment in some ways, but also building the trust that is needed um, to do relational assessment in a good way. Um, the other thing that we need to do is to pay attention to our interactions in community by visiting. And this was one of the things that a lot of indigenous practitioners remarked during the consultations, importance of visiting as a practice of assessment. So when we visit with the community, and by visiting, I don't mean having a work meeting, right? Like a work meeting is different than just going to visit with someone. So when we go to visit with someone, we notice things that we otherwise wouldn't see, hear, or feel in a formal meeting. We can notice who talks to us and who doesn't, who talks to us more, who's more comfortable around us, what kinds of things we talk about when we're just hanging out, whether there is laughter, gratitude, anger, or other emotions. So um, it's just a matter of paying attention to our interactions, the quality of those interactions, and what they say about the relationship that we hold with our partners. So the next thing to keep in mind for relational assessment is that, and this is a point that we've made throughout the Launch and Learns too, we often say we work with a community. But sometimes we don't work with a community, we work with people who are part of a community. So for relational assessment, it is important that we get a sense of who we have relationships with the community, how those relationships are doing, and always strive to diversify those relationships. Um, this will help us with the process of assessment itself. It will mean that when we do assessments, either a program assessment or a relational assessment, our data set is more rich. We're listening to more voices, and we're capturing more perspectives. It also means that the more people and groups we include in our partnerships and our relational assessment, the better job we're doing at caring for those relationships in the community, instead of just prioritizing a small group of people with it is easier for us to work with. So the following point is to keep in mind that relationships change over time. Just like any personal relationship that we might have, the more time we spend with someone, the more things we share together, the more challenges we overcome, the more relationships grow. But there's also the inverse, in the sense that sometimes relationships don't grow but diminish. Sometimes we lose touch with people, we move in different directions, and that trust and closeness also diminishes. And also, when working with communities, I mean, people oftentimes come and go from a community organization or a community. People change roles, they step into different places in life. Maybe they become parents and have less time for working in a project. Work, political circumstances change. So it is important to always assess our assessment, which is another language we use in the framework, and ask ourselves, do the methods, strategies, and approaches that I use to assess the relationships I have with the community need to change in light of changing circumstances? So along with relational assessment, or part of that relational assessment with the community, is also a critical reflection component where we have to constantly come back to this question of, um, is the relationship changing, and do I need to adjust the ways that I do assessment with the community? So in the same way as with the systems change tool, when we release the framework on May 27 during the launch, we'll also be releasing a relational assessment guide. This is a very cool document that we've put a lot of work into, and it basically provides the essential themes and topics for our individual reflection as practitioners, and a set of questions, a conversation guide to help us create relational assessment opportunities, practices, activities with the communities that we work with across the 5 stages of engagement. So it has a section for when you're just doing the work before the work, things you should reflect on your own, and the kind of conversations you should have with your potential partners. The same thing for forming, maintaining, closing a partnership, and then things to keep in mind and chat with the community after we have closed our formal partnerships. So definitely keep an eye open for that. If you're joining us during the framework launch, you'll get a copy of that, but a very, very useful document that I recommend everyone to take a look at. So how are we doing for time? Okay, so perfect. We're gonna move on to our reflection questions now. So we're gonna go into small breakout rooms as usual and discuss some of the questions that are in the screen. So if you get to all of them, that will be great. If you don't, you just choose the ones that are more relevant to you or that the group wants to talk about. So the questions relate to system change more than relational assessment. And the first one has to do with the barriers that you might have encountered in your work to working in good ways with Indigenous communities. Then we'll ask that you reflect about those different circles of concern, influence, and control. So maybe you identify a barrier around ceremony. So that is your circle of concern. Who can you talk to? What resources do you have? How can you influence changes regarding those barriers in the institution? That's your circle of influence. And then what actions can you directly take? That's your circle of control. Who is, what people are in those circles, and what context and resources. And then lastly, who can help you implement and advocate for those changes, both at the institutional or the grassroots level. So you might talk to your supervisor, you might talk to the VP of Indigenous VP at the university, someone at the Indigenous Student Center, different things for help, but also other people doing similar work in the institution. So yeah, I think Annie is gonna invite us into breakout rooms, and we'll have about 15 minutes to chat about these questions, correct?
Yep, gonna open them now. Nikki, you can stop recording.
Okay, and then we'll come back and